The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by Northeast Solar, homegrown in Hatfield, Massachusetts, and providing energy savings for their customers for over 10 years. Learn more at northeast-solar.com.
Welcome to a bonus episode of the Fabulous 413. I'm Khalees Smith. On today's show, we had a chance to speak with Juliana Merullo, who crafted a piece on the July 2023 floods that affected a lot of the farmland in western Massachusetts. Rather than just give you the snippets that you were able to hear in our show, we decided it might be best for everyone to hear the full piece that she produced. It is pretty fantastic. Thanks so much to Juliana for allowing us to post it here in our feed for everyone to enjoy. Without further ado, we present to you Deep Water by Juliana Merullo.
By the end of 1997, David Fisher was looking to start a farm. He'd grown up in the suburbs north of New York, but after working and apprenticing on farms for years, he was ready to settle down on a piece of land and try to grow his own food. His friend Arthur told him about 20 acres of bottomland along the South River in Conway, Massachusetts.
And there's this farm and a barn full of horse-drawn equipment and 2 empty cabins, and I'm just like, what? Like all these things would just seem like a total fantasy to me.
David was living in Maine at the time, but would go and visit Arthur and help him with little jobs when he could. David came to the farm for New Year's Eve, and taking a walk that night,
I remember the night being completely bathed in moonlight, and I stepped out into the field, into that moonlit field, and I just paused for a moment, and I could just see, like plain as day, horses working in the field, crops growing, families and children kind of scurrying about.
David started Natural Roots Farm that next spring and has been farming there for the last 26 years. I grew up on the other side of Conway, and most summers I would make the 20-minute drive with one of my parents on dirt roads to get to Natural Roots. It's a community-supported agriculture farm, or CSA, where customers buy a share at the beginning of the season and then come every week to pick up that share's worth of vegetables. It's a good model for families like mine because we get a steady supply of vegetables for the summer and fall. We know our money is staying close to home. We meet the farmer at the distribution barn each week. It's a good model for farmers, too, because they get guaranteed money at the beginning of the season when they have to pay for seeds and equipment and fertilizers. It's supposed to be insurance for them, so they have a steady customer base locked in before the season starts. But what happens when that model is tested like it was last summer? Whose responsibility is it to help farmers when they lose everything? When the waters that almost wash them away are rising in your backyard, too? Act 1. The floods. On distribution days in the summer, the walls of the barn at Natural Roots are lined with baskets literally overflowing with produce from the farm's 7 acres. Cabbages and hardy greens and zucchinis and tomatoes and herbs, with chalkboards saying how much of each you can take. Most days there's at least one thing you can pick yourself. At the beginning of the season, it's green beans. By July, blackberries. The barn is just up the hill from the South River, and the fields are on the other side of the river in a small valley. As a kid, I was always scared of the suspended wooden footbridge you have to cross to get over there. It bounces too much in the middle. Walking across that bridge sort of feels like walking back in time 100 years. I should mention here that Natural Roots is completely live powered.
And then Tim, and then the reddish one here is Land, and then that's Gus.
Instead of tractors or trucks, they use a team of horses to till the land, spread the seeds, and move their mobile chicken coop between the fields. The main crop field is 15 yards back from the banks of the river, and on a summer day you see the farm staff picking crops by hand, and David, with his long beard and sun-faded hat, standing on a cart behind a team of 4 horses. David says this land wants to be farmed, but he also has been here long enough to know that the very thing that makes it so great for farming could also be a force of destruction. The river that's been depositing riverbed silt on the fields for thousands of years is also their main source of irrigation and protection against drought. But when those waters rise, there's very little to stop them from rushing over the banks and onto their crop fields. In late August of 2011, when Hurricane Irene swept through, it was early enough in the growing season that their crops were still in the field. They knew it was coming, so they put a call out to the community for help harvesting as much of the produce as they could. The storm came, the fields flooded, and they lost the crops they hadn't been able to harvest. Suddenly, David wondered if it was even smart to keep farming on that land at all.
I remember talking to some neighbor friends. They'd been farming together just a couple miles up the road for years and generations. And I asked for their advice, and I'm like, what do you think? Am I crazy to be farming here on this, on this piece of land? And they were like, oh, back in 1938, the big flood, like, washed all the, all the factories out of Conway, and there was 13 dams, and they all got washed away. It just kind of put it in perspective, and I was like, okay, intense stuff happens sometimes, but it still felt like such a vibrant piece of land with so much to offer that it never really occurred to me to do anything else.
Do you still feel the same way after this summer? Yeah.
Yeah, that's like the question.
Heavy rain slamming communities across western Massachusetts Monday. Many hit with rapidly rising water levels.
With the storm last July, they had less time to prepare.
It was a very different experience from Hurricane Irene, where there was no, this big storm is coming your way. July 10th was like another wet day after however many really wet days we'd had.
It was a Monday morning when the farm crew has their weekly team meeting. Britt Terry is the farm manager at Natural Roots and the only crew member who isn't living on the farm in the summer.
I got in at 8:30. It was raining. The river was very high. Actually took a video of it, but the fields were dry. I was standing, in this one spot of the field taking this quick little video, and then went up to morning meeting. And then right as we were wrapping up, Maggie and I were still in the office, and we got a call from a neighbor who had been driving by that our fields were flooded and that our chickens were floating down the river.
And after meeting, I went down to the fields. I was like, okay, I should probably check on the field to see what's happening. And as soon as I got down there, the water had like already, within an hour, it had gone from 2, 3, 4 feet below the banks to like already coming over the banks. And, ran up to the house, sounded the alarm, told everyone to, bust it down to the field immediately.
Maggie Torin is David's partner and was working with Britt in the office after the meeting that morning.
And so we all got our gear. For me, I thought to put on my rain pants and my rain boots, my raincoat, and just down into the field. And then you're assessing.
When I got down to the field, I could see that spot that I had taken that video from was now 5 feet underwater.
Just came up so fast. I look up to see our chickens starting to just flow down the river, like one after the next. And I realized, okay, this is coming really fast. So I yelled to, my crew, save the chickens. And, they went after the chickens, and I ran up to the barn to get a team of horses because our mobile chicken coop that's on wheels was clearly about to go underwater or get washed away as well with all the rest of the chickens.
The apprentices had already jumped into the floodwater and were trying to catch chickens as they were floating away. I also jumped into the river, realized it was going to pull me down if I didn't get back out and take off my rain gear and take off my boots. So I actually stripped off my rain gear and jumped back in my socks to try to get closer to the apprentices who were, chest neck deep in water, just trying to catch chickens with their arms and then wade themselves back out.
And my crew, my 2 apprentices, my son, Gabriel, they're all these chickens are just literally getting washed down the river. They're grabbing them as they come by, grabbing one until their arms are totally full. And, I remember Rachel being like, I can't hold any more chickens. And then, Gabriel would be like, it's okay, take them to high ground. And then he would tag in behind her and catch the next bunch of chickens. They were cycling around until they couldn't hold chickens anymore. And, at one point, the conditions were changing so fast that what seemed like an obvious move initially, go there, wade into the water and catch the chickens, before too long was whoa, is this even safe?
At one point in time, the fence itself got pulled out from the ground, came unstaked. And so then there was 150 feet of net that came down the river. And was underwater and tangled up in other things. I got my foot hooked and tripped and kind of went under and was we're done. This is no longer a reasonable thing for us to be doing.
In a crisis situation, somehow something inside you ranks order of importance. And so I was worried about the chickens, but if all the chickens had flooded down the river, the most important thing to me were that our people were safe. And so that was what I was paying the most attention to, again, knowing we did have waders on and there was just so much water moving through. It's I value the life of our chickens, of course, but if we lost 200 chickens, it's fine, but we aren't going to lose any of our people.
Once David had brought the horses and pulled the chicken coop to safety, the crew tried to save as much equipment as they could before the water carried it away.
By 12:30, we had done everything we could and came up to dry off and warm up and just decompress and make sure everyone was okay. That was when the emergency call came through from the town that there was a flood, which was like, yes, we know. A little too late, thank you. But then by like 1:30 or 2, the floodwater had receded, which was very surreal. It's like, did that actually just happen?
I remember feeling that the apprentices just thought like, this is what happens at Natural Roots. It's like, you just like, then you're chest deep in water with chickens and what do we do tomorrow?
This was the first and worst of 3 big floods on Natural Roots last summer. After the first one, they tried to restore some sense of normalcy to the farm. They brought the equipment back down to the fields. David and the horses pulled the mobile chicken coop back so the chickens could graze on the cover crop. And then, 5 days after the river had jumped its banks the first time, it happened again.
We're back at it, pulling the chickens up to higher ground again and moving the fencing again and pulling equipment out of the field again.
5 more days later, and the third flood was starting to feel like Groundhog Day.
There were some folks from some TV crew from Boston that were, here, and they wanted to do this whole interview and so on. And literally, like, as they're setting up the camera, my friend drives in and he's like, I just came from downtown Conway. Like, the roads are overflowing. Like, water's coming your way. And I was like, hang on, I'll be right back. Got back to it with the horses and the cart. And it was this, like, instant replay for the third time. Like, okay, we got to move the chickens again. Except the road had gotten totally washed out by the downpour that day. It was like, where do I go? I can't go that way because the river is overflowing. I certainly can't cross the river and it's like starting to flood my fields. I can't retreat to higher ground this way because the road is just destroyed. In that moment, it struck me as kind of like a premonition to our like state, at large here, where it's like we've kind of created this disaster and like there aren't really any like great escape routes. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah.
The Fabulous 413 podcast is funded by the UMass 5 College Credit Union, offering co-op advantage checking with cash back on all purchases, plus secure debit card controls, all from the UMass 5 mobile banking app. Insured by NCUA, umass5.coop. NEPM's podcasts are funded by Armbrook Village, offering research-based arts, music, fitness, and lifelong learning programs at their assisted living and Alzheimer's care community in Westfield. armbrookvillage.com.
Act 2. The Funds. In the days following the first flood, before they knew there would be a second and a third, there was a lot of uncertainty about how Natural Roots would move forward. So much was happening at once. Volunteers from the community were coming to help clear the fields. Politicians were making the rounds to survey the damage and voice their support. Representatives from the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, MDAR, were coming to help determine if any of the crops still in the ground were safe to eat. And David and Maggie were realizing how much help they would need to move forward. They weren't the only farmers going through this.
I'm not tooting my own horn, but I think I got the ball rolling and made the first call to Joe Comerford.
Bernie Smorowski and his 4 brothers run the family potato farm out of Hatfield, Massachusetts, about 25 minutes south of Natural Roots. They have 700 acres along the Connecticut and Deerfield rivers and sell their crop wholesale to grocery stores, restaurants, and institutions across the Northeast. On July 10th, the day of the first flood, Bernie drove around with his brother and watched as the water came over the banks. All they could do was watch. So that night, he made a call.
When the first rain came, I had a call on our district voicemail from Bernie Smorowski. And Bernie said, I got to have Senator Comerford call me back. I need her to understand what's happening. And I called him back and I could hear in Bernie's voice, Joe, this is Bernie, you got to come. I understood the urgency, the panic, the fear, the anger, the sorrow, You could hear that in his message and when I talked with him. But
Joe Comerford is the state senator for a big portion of Western Mass, including Northampton and Hatfield, where Bernie's fields are. She was one of many local officials who went around to farms devastated by the flooding.
I said, Bernie, can I come and see your land, And he took me out to this place, and I looked out, and it was as if the land was the river itself. I just was looking with this man at the devastation of his crops and understanding that, that it was all gone.
It took a few weeks for the MDAR agents to determine what crops could be harvested and which ones would have to be returned to the soil uneaten. They were worried about what contaminants might have been in the river water that flooded the fields. In the meantime, farmers like Bernie and Maggie and David had to figure out how they were going to pay their bills. Farming is a tough business, and making it work financially is tricky for farms of all sizes. One of the benefits of Natural Roots' CSA model is that the farm gets an influx of cash at the beginning of the season to help them purchase supplies. But that money still isn't enough to keep the farm going. Natural Roots has a farm store in the distribution barn that makes up half their income, and without the foot traffic from CSA members coming to pick up their shares every week, Maggie and David couldn't rely on that either. Farmers like Bernie, who operate with a wholesale model, have to take out operating loans at the start of every season. Once they've harvested and sold their crop for the year, they pay off those loans and hopefully have enough left over to make a small profit. Margins are super thin. If they lose a big portion of their crop to floods, those loans still need to be repaid. You might be thinking, it's a good thing they have crop insurance then. Farming is so unpredictable, it would be stupid to not have some protection against something like this. Let's debunk that real quick. Federal crop insurance policies are usually taken out for a single crop. It depends on the policy, but for catastrophic risk protection, farmers typically will have to lose over 50% of their crop. Even in that case, they only get back 50% of the market value they would have sold it for. Massachusetts State Representative Natalie Blais represents 17 small towns in western Massachusetts, including Conway and Natural Roots.
If you're talking about insurance, the federal programs are not designed to help the small farmer. They're just not. They are really designed to provide assistance for large-scale farms, typically in the Midwest, that are growing a single product.
David had looked into it at one point, but realized pretty quickly that it made no sense for their farm.
We could take out a policy on arugula, and we could take a policy out on green beans, but we're not talking about like acres of green beans. We're talking about, I got like 750 feet of green beans, and that system does not work for this kind of farm.
Even Bernie, with almost 700 acres of potatoes, doesn't have crop insurance because it doesn't make sense for them either. They lost 35 to 40% of their crop last summer, $1.25 million in losses.
I met with an insurance adjuster, and he thought we could get a claim. And then after he ran the numbers that I gave him, what we harvested compared to what we lost, he said, unfortunately, you wouldn't have got $1.
So then what do? Loan programs that are sometimes available to farmers after natural disasters only put them further in the hole. They really just need cash grants. So here we are at this crossroads. The flooding events themselves have happened, even though their after effects are just beginning to be felt. Crop insurance isn't riding in like the knight in red tape to save the day. And here are these two farms, different sizes with different models, both determined to figure out how they'll keep going. And this is where their stories diverge.
Farmers are proud people. We don't want to ask for money.
Bernie didn't like it, but he knew he had no other choice when he called up Joe Comerford on the day of the flood. This was the third of 3 bad years for farmers. Now, with these floods, most farmers in the area were unsure how they were going to get through to the next season.
So I said to Joe, is there anything you can do and put together a package for farmers?
Joe Comerford, the state senator, wrote a memo that night and sent it off to her colleagues in Boston and the commissioner of MDAR, Ashley Randall. That kickstarted a series of visits from politicians and officials, including the governor of Massachusetts, Maura Healey. Natalie Blais, the representative in Conway, was on a lot of these tours.
The governor was with us in Deerfield, and I'll never forget this conversation where we sort of circled around after the conversation with the farmers, and she said, by the end of this week, we will have a fund up and running to support farmers. And I'm going to be honest with you, I was like, okay, Governor, whatever you say. And sure enough, by the end of the week, they had a logo, they had an event. we had a fund for farmers.
The Farm Resiliency Fund was spearheaded in part by the governor, but it was a private fund organized by 3 local organizations, and it took donations directly from the public. The fund ended up raising $3.3 million, which was distributed to over 230 local farms who had registered their losses. There were 2 rounds of checks, with a maximum of $10,000 per check, and the first ones were sent out as early as September. But total losses on farms in Massachusetts were more than $65 million. So Natalie Blais and Joe Comerford were still working to secure a state fund that could offer even more support. In the end, that came through a supplemental budget that was making its way through the State House at the time. They were able to add in a $20 million fund with money for farmers. On July 31st, 3 weeks after the first flooding, Governor Healey signed the budget into law, creating the Natural Disaster Recovery Program. To receive money, farms had to show that they had lost at least 15% of their total planted acreage. The max grant amount was $350,000, and all of it was direct cash assistance, checks that were mailed out to farmers in December.
It was the first time that farmers in Massachusetts, and I think in the surrounding area, have received direct cash assistance for disasters. I can't emphasize enough what a remarkable thing that happened.
Bernie was one of the beneficiaries.
There was a maximum amount you could get, and that was $350,000, and that's what we got. But our losses were over $1.25 million. We'll never look a gift horse in the mouth. You take what you can get, and we're very appreciative, absolutely. I don't want to say anything negative. They worked hard for us and did what they could.
Do you wish when you hear about farms that had GoFundMes and raised money that way, did you ever think of doing something like that, or was it?
No. It's just not for us,
Because it wouldn't be enough money, or because you don't have, that kind of direct interaction with people, or because it just...
See, I think it's a society issue where I'd rather have it come from state. Everybody pays, the taxpayer. We're all in this together. And instead of relying on, the generosity of people, which is great, these people who do the GoFundMes, but I wouldn't do that. I'm, kind of proud, try not to ask for money. So
for me, myself, I'm like, it feels like kind of uncomfortable, like just asking the world for money, like if, I don't know, whatever. It just hasn't sat right with me personally.
In the immediate aftermath of the flood, before these funds were raised or allocated, David didn't have high hopes for getting help from the government.
So at no point along the way have I been like, oh, the government's going to take care of it all. I've mostly been like, we're going to find our own way, Great, if they can do some good, let them do some good, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
After the flooding in 2011 from Hurricane Irene, friends had told him to reach out to his representatives to see if there was state or federal support for farmers.
Calling every office that I could find to call. And I never got a call back from anybody.
I know David has talked about how they were calling people trying to get anybody to listen, and just there was no response. Whereas here, the governor called me on the telephone. The lieutenant governor was here. Our representatives were here. It was just such a huge response from the state and government that it was really, we were just operating in a completely different realm of interest, basically.
Maura Healey called you on the phone?
She did.
What was that? Wait, what?
It was so cute. My caller ID said, Gila, comma, Maura. And I was like, I wonder, hello. She's like, hi, Magdalena, this is Maura. And it took me a few seconds to be like, Maura, it's actually Maura Healey, our governor, calling on the phone. And she was just calling to check in.
U.S. Senator Ed Markey visited the farm too. There's a photo of him standing next to David in the field, Markey towering over David, his white button-down and black dress shoes standing out next to David's red hat and dusty work boots. All these representatives were pledging their support and listening to how they could be most helpful. But at that point, it was unclear if state support would actually come through. And at the same time, there had been a huge outpouring of support from community members who wanted to help Natural Roots in whatever way they could. So they realized pretty quickly that this was a time when they needed to ask the community for help.
If we keep the financial reality of the farm secret, it feels like it would be somehow like a deep disrespect to the people who have supported us for all the years to just one day be like, oh, sorry, we couldn't make it work out. We ran out of money, wasn't a viable business.
Maggie, David, and Britt set up a GoFundMe 3 days after the first July 10th flood. I donated. My parents donated. Former teachers and neighbors donated. Within 2 weeks, this small farm in Conway, Massachusetts had reached its goal of $85,000.
We got so many donations from people who aren't even CSA customers. People from across the country who don't even ever eat our food. It's but there's something about what's happening here that is so meaningful to people that they're willing to send hundreds or thousands of dollars from across the country. And for me, it's kind of takes it out of the personal, and it's okay, what is going on here that is speaking to people? And how can I continue to cultivate that?
As the donations were pouring in from across the country, the day-to-day life of the farm kept going, even if it looked different. Soon after the first flood, food safety agents from the Department of Agricultural Resources came out to the farm to survey the damage. They told Maggie and David that because there might have been pollutants in the river water, none of the food was safe to eat. 5 weeks into the growing season, and they were done for the year.
Even the stuff that looks like it might be salvageable, we actually can't harvest any of this food. That was kind of whoa moment. Frustrating. There was some anger there. I was like, the heck, it should be fine. It looks fine. I don't think there's really a problem.
I mean, I assume that during a normal year, when you have a normal crop, you all are eating that. Was it weird to not have your own vegetables?
It was so weird. And we went through a process around that because, we thought, well, will we keep a little plot for ourselves? There's all this food and it's really probably fine. And we've eaten flooded field. We water the fields from the river. It's a little confusing. And we decided, no, we would join our community in the loss, basically.
Even if they weren't safe to eat, those crops were just sitting in the fields.
It was going to fall on David to till all the crops into the ground. And that, I would say, is one of the most painful and intimate parts of the flood was actually there was a lot of food here in these fields.
That's our job, is to carefully tend and protect and, feed and nurture these plants. And it's okay, and we're now going to chop these things into little bits and turn them over upside down. So it was intense. Yeah, it was intense.
They hadn't raised enough money at that point to even think about offering refunds to the CSA members, who now wouldn't be getting any of the food they'd already paid for.
The thought that we would just be well, sorry, no more food, that was a tough one for us to just accept and sit with. And yes, the CSA model, it's part of the deal is customers take on some of the risk along with the farmer. We get that. But this just seemed pretty extreme, I mean, historically for us, what that looks like is oh, this year tomato season was later, or it was shorter, or broccoli sucked this year, or whatever that thing is, but there's still food,
David knew that farmers often don't harvest everything that they grow, and sometimes have surplus just sitting in the fields. So he sent out a message in the listserv for farmers in the area, asking if anyone had any surplus produce the Natural Roots crew could go harvest to provide some vegetables for their shareholders.
It started kind of small and then very quickly snowballed, where people are oh yeah, we have extra this, or we're not going to harvest this, or I got this field that it's more than we need, or and people from not just in the valley here, but it seemed the word kind of spread, and next thing people farms in Boston and people out past Albany, or people are driving from the Hudson Valley with truckloads of produce to to help feed our membership. And it's just oh my gosh, this is incredible.
Instead of spending their summer days harvesting their own crops, the crew would split up to different farms in the area to harvest surplus there.
We had food for our customers the entire rest of the season just from surpluses.
So there was this incredible outpouring of support, not just financial support from people across the country, but also support from fellow farmers. And that meant the farm could keep going. But at the same time, everything was different. The floods last summer were a major natural disaster. I lived in Conway my whole life, and I never thought we would see that kind of destruction. And that sticks with you. I was talking with my representative, Natalie, about this.
Anytime it rained after that, there was just a sense of dread that we'd be seeing more damage on farms. And so, I remember being in Boston after that first storm event And it was raining back in the district, and people were texting me that it was raining back in the district. It was almost like post-traumatic stress.
There were 3 floods that summer. There was an exhaustion, I have to say, for us in having to tell the story. And so the kindnesses and the generosity of our membership in the community were very, very grounding. But also we were dealing with the loss and learning like a whole new skill set on top of that around fundraising and holding these huge questions about the future of farming.
Act 3. The future. I said that David and Bernie's experiences diverged at some point in the aftermath of the floods. What I meant was that David and Maggie, because of the nature of the CSA model, but also just because of who they are, had cultivated a community of people that responded in force when they were needed. This community helped them raise $91,000 through their GoFundMe and supplied them with food for their shareholders for the whole season. They did receive an initial $10,000 check from the private Farm Resiliency Fund. But even though they applied, they didn't receive any money from the $20 million state fund. The state had taken into account the GoFundMe and prioritized farms that didn't have those means of fundraising. Farms like Bernie's, who had to rely on state aid to make back any of their losses. And don't get me wrong, the state came through big time. When I started this project, I thought it would be a story about how our government isn't set up to help farms when a natural disaster like this happens. And the federal government wasn't much help. But the fact that the state passed that budget, allocated $20 million to be given out as grants as quickly as they did, really was remarkable. And yet, for Bernie, it still wasn't enough to cover even half of his losses. What does that say about farm economics broadly? That farmers are scraping by just enough that an event like this threatens their whole business? Why is that?
Like the living components of the farm it is working. We're not struggling with like crops that are just diseased and dying. We're not like running out of fertility. But then it's like we're all operating in the kitchen of this capitalist system that's like dictating the rules of how exchanges work. And that's the part that's not working.
Farms have been going out of business in Western Mass, selling pieces of their land, telling their customers that they just couldn't make the economics work.
It's also pretty distressing to see that like, actually there's like a lot of farms that, one bad year could be the end of them. Like, are we okay with that? Like, are we like, yeah, hope the people that feed us, like, good luck. It's tough work, it's tough business. Climate's getting totally extreme and unpredictable. And like, yeah, we hope they can stay in business. There's a point to which you can have that stance and you still get to eat. But then there's a point beyond which, like, you can't have that stance if you want to eat.
But whose responsibility is it to help these farmers?
It's not like just like, everyone needs to like chip in and support their local farmer. Like, there's communities that like, can barely like put diapers on their kids, let alone try to figure out how to support, a nearby farmer, if there even is a farmer,
I mean, is it too much to ask people to support their neighbors when their houses and apartments are being flooded too? Even in Conway, Natural Roots wasn't the only one suffering from the floods.
The town of Conway was designated by the National Weather Service as the rainiest town in North America for the month of July.
That's Phil Cantor. He's the chair of the Conway Town Select Board.
We sustained almost $5 million of damages from the July floods. Our annual budget, not counting schools, is $2.8 million.
Phil lives in downtown Conway, about 1.5 miles away from Natural Roots, tracing the South River the whole way. He was home on July 10th.
All of our basements flooded, and you were looking at water rising hundreds, thousands of gallons coming into your basements per minute. It was insane. I never saw anything like it. By the time I called 911, because I could see that my basement was 3 feet deep, my electric panel is at 5 feet. By the time I called them to get here, I had lost my electric panel. By the time they got here and got all their hoses hooked up, just in that 15, 20 minutes, water rose 2 feet. They were pumping 4,000 gallons per minute with their giant pumps, and it was staying even. It wasn't reducing.
Phil didn't have any faith that the state would come to the town's aid. Conway is too small, too rural, too far from Boston. After larger cities in the eastern part of the state were hit with bad floods later in the year, the legislature ended up passing another $15 million supplemental budget with money to help municipalities that were hit by natural disasters. Phil didn't think Conway would get a big slice of the pie.
And I was telling everybody we'll be lucky if we get 100,000 because we're Conway. Yeah.
Natalie Blay, who represents Conway and had been pushing on their behalf, called Phil to tell him that Conway was getting $1.245 million of the total $15 million. the second largest amount for any town in the state.
And so when they actually came through this time, like a lot of us got together and like we cried. We're like so happy. We're not going to have a tax raise because of this.
The $35 million in total disaster aid the state was able to pass for farms and municipalities gave them some breathing room. It didn't cover all their losses, but it was a start. And yet, climate change means disasters like this are even more likely to happen in the future.
These weren't one-off events. We are going to continue to see storms like this hit the Commonwealth, probably more severely going forward as we see the impacts of climate change. We can't allow our communities and our constituents to be held to relief that is tied to our legislative cycle. But what happens if there's not a bill moving when disaster strikes?
In November, Natalie Blais and Joe Comerford filed a new bill to create a permanent natural disaster relief fund in Massachusetts. It would be a $250 million rainy day fund that could be made available even if a state or federal disaster wasn't declared. Which is good, because the flooding in Western Mass didn't meet the FEMA minimum required for federal disaster relief aid either. In January, Governor Maura Healey released her budget for the next year and incorporated the relief fund into her proposal. Massachusetts is one of few states without a fund like this. So if the river rises again next year, or in 2 years or 5 years, maybe there will be money already set aside. And that's huge. We're going to need that money, and we're going to need to think through new ways to grow food in a more intense climate future. But David also thinks that can only do so much.
What practices would we employ that would be resilient to like 6 feet of water rushing over, over my crops or my, if I'm trying to grow food, like what food is there that's resilient to this kind of flooding? I don't know.
At this point, the only certain thing might be that these floods will come again.
We had biblical rain, Old Testament Noah style rains. It seems to be a near monthly thing now.
Act 4, the fears.
For like weeks and months after that first flood, you're like, oh, how are you doing? Like we know the crops are lost, whatever. How are you doing? I'm like, well, totally disaster, totally devastating on the one hand. And then with this like unprecedented, phenomenal boost of support from the community that's just been staggering. And so in the middle, somewhere I'm like, I'm fine. It's like, I think in the end, I'm fine. But it's just like such an interesting process because I feel like, I'm like holding all these parts of myself at the same time. The one part that's like, it's like, dude, just like shake it off. Like shit happens. It's not a big deal, There's that part. And then there's the part where it's like, ultimately, if like we're just gonna get washed away, doesn't matter how skillful we are, how much community support we have. It's like nature's gonna do what it's gonna do with us.
Do you have any fears going into this next growing season? It's kind of big.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. It's taken everything I've got to build this farm into its present form. And I'm like, what if we just keep getting flooded every year? And like, I can't cross the river for like most of the year. And it's, there isn't money or there isn't, to put it all back together. That seems like a real question. And like, yeah, that's scary. And I think the other day when I was like contemplating these very questions myself, I came out of the field and there's a squirrel. And I watch the squirrel and he's like leaving the field and he's like going up into the trees. And I'm just like, of course.
Or do you ever think about picking up and leaving? Just going to another field, another place?
I mean, it's certainly a question, I've had a lot of conversations where people are like, oh, you should just find like the farm that's going to be like resilient to it all, and I'm like, does that exist? I don't know if that exists, I love this place. I have a very special, intimate relationship with this land. These buildings like this, like the time I've raised my kids here, like the community is just woven into this place. It's like, it's not just a piece of land to grow crops on, it's like, this is my home.
I spoke with Maggie and David in February. They were already preparing for the spring season, in many ways just as they've prepared for spring for the last 2 decades. But things have changed.
For me, I always have said that the farm is the place where everything makes sense. And it's like the world can just not make any sense. And most of the time I feel like it doesn't. But the farm always makes sense. And it's such a place of restoration for people and hope. But something had been destabilized that had, for all of us, been very stable. And that won't go totally away.
Maggie worries they aren't the only ones shaken by last year. In February, they still had 25 to 30% of their membership shares available when they normally sell out completely. There's no way to know how directly that's related to the flooding, but Maggie is very aware it could flood again this year.
There is the before the flood and after the flood, where we now just stand in a totally different place. And now I am different than I was before. There's just no way of knowing what's going to happen. And I think there are probably people who are like, you guys are crazy, you're going to plant in that field again? But this is where our community has access to the farm, and this is our main crop field. So yeah, we're going to try it again. And I feel prepared in some way, on some part of my being, that we could lose it all again. But there's no way of knowing, and I can't decide to not grow here based on that 1 year.
In Hatfield, Bernie Smorowski is getting ready for his farm's 102nd season.
Sometimes I don't sleep well at night, and I'm just laying in bed, and you just think, and it's not good health-wise, but I've seen other disasters. It wasn't my first disaster. It wasn't my first rodeo, bluntly. You deal with it. If you don't deal with it, you go crazy.
How many years of this do you think you could take?
I talked to my brothers about that. It would be tough to take another year, but that's why I looked into the insurance. I don't know if we could take another year like this.
A lot has happened since David first saw the river rushing over its banks last July. The floodwaters had receded by the end of the day, but the impact has continued to echo in the months since. There's a way you can look at this story as heartwarming. Communities rallied around their local farms and farmers. State representatives listened and did the work to make public funding available to farmers in towns that needed it. Farmers who thought they had lost everything are still farming this next season. But you can also see this story as depressing. The squirrel on David's field was just the canary in the coal mine telling us what we refuse to hear. Even when the community and the government do what they're supposed to do, it's still not enough money to make up what was lost. With every next climate change-fueled disaster, our farmers seem to be getting closer and closer to a point of no return. And yes, that's bad for our food systems, but it's also bad for the people who make them run.
We're in deep water. This is a deep water time, and I could say that I'm scared, but I'm not scared, but it's kind of like that. There's a severity to the situation that I now understand. And now I have to live my life carrying that severity of awareness. And at the same time, maybe this is the heartwarming part, but life is beautiful anyway. And we celebrate and are grateful. But this is a different time.